Hi there, this is Reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Chapter 29, Part 3. The next day he is at the library waiting for it to open, and when it does, he begins to read furiously, back behind Plato for the first time, into what little is known of those rhetoricians he so despised. And what he discovers begins to confirm what he has already intuited from his thoughts the evening before. Okay, so what we're going to do in this chapter is we're going to trace the history of thought that led us to believe that the law of gravity is a fixed entity just waiting for Newton to discover. We're going to go back to the origins of the Western way of thinking that eventually in Pirsig's work is going to be called subject-object metaphysics, which has already been commented on in this book and will be conceptualized in Lila. So I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to summarize the timeline and then add a few quotes. So the problem is, why does Plato hate the sophists? So first of all, remember that what the sophists say may very well be Plato's words, and as Socrates' words are Plato's words, and Aristotle mentions this. So we're going to take what they say with a grain of salt. It doesn't seem that the sophists are hated in general in Greek society. So what's Plato's real purpose? There is a huge struggle between good and true for the mind of man at this time, and truth won. And this is what our reality is today, is truth and not quality. And somehow Plato's hatred of the sophists is involved in that. Early Greek philosophy is the first conscious search for the imperishable in affairs of men. Up until now, the imperishable has been within the domain of gods and myths. And I want to mention something briefly that I just heard. So I don't know if you guys ever listened to the Uber Boyo podcast. It tends to orient around Carl Jung. And today in the podcast, they were trying to say, how do you get into the consciousness of mankind way before the scientific age and beyond that, and maybe even before the Greek period of philosophy, this thriving of culture that we're talking about now. And what he said, and I love this because I totally agree, that book, the Bicameral Mind, gives you a sense of what it's like to be someone in these early times, in these pre-Greek times. And in those times, you actually feel like things that are happening within your head are given to you by the gods, for example. Before you can actually name externalities, the way of naming externalities are within the domain of the gods. So something like what is consistent in our experience is going to be in the domain of the gods. I'll put that link to the Uber Boyo podcast. It just came up today, so I'm kind of throwing it in here, even though I've already written this. Okay, so the next thing, Greeks increasingly, and this is interesting because this is in the Bicameral Mind. There's a separation between feeling like everything is influenced by the gods and feeling like you have an internal locus of control. That starts happening in ancient Greece and in this period, after, I think it's the difference between 800 BC and 500 BC, or something like that. Not sure exactly, but at one point, the way of understanding changes, and the Greeks become increasingly impartial to the external world and increasingly able to abstract concepts out of that world. And this transcendent type of consciousness belongs to the Greeks alone. So myths, they begin to see myths as rather an art form than truth. So the consciousness is evolving. And like I said, Bicameral Mind is the best thing I've read so far that describes the experience of this shift in consciousness. So as the Greeks become more impartial to the world around them, and Pirsig doesn't say why, so Bicameral, one thing that does say why this happened, Bicameral Mind does have some explanations. Vervaeke has explanations for this too, and if you look at the earlier parts of Vervaeke's work, you're going to see how impartiality begins to become part of our experience, ability to separate from the gods. Vervaeke's very good at this too. So the Greeks' power of abstraction increased. They stopped seeing that the myths of the gods are responsible for what is imperishable, and they began to look for the imperishable in the material world. So, but the mythos, this is all part of the mythos. The mythos is, you could say, the mythos is something that builds on itself. It is linear time because it evolves. Evolution is linear time. And so as the mythos goes on, this increasing impartiality destroys the old mythos and becomes the new mythos. And rather than mythology, we now have philosophy. It's the first time in history. So we talked about the mythos in a couple of chapters back, which is that huge body of common knowledge that unites our minds as cells are united in the body of a man, Pirsig said, which is beautiful. And what destroys the old mythos here is, of course, the growing autonomy of man, the ability to abstract principles rather than to attribute all observed and experienced phenomena to the gods. So this group of pre-Socratic philosophers, we can call them the cosmologists. Each had their own idea of what the essential immortal principle was, this essential imperishable principle. So various philosophers each advocated for one or the other of the elements, water, fire, air, etc. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. So Pythagoras said that the immortal principle is number, and that is out of this, after the elemental understanding of the mortal principle, this is the one that is non-material. And beyond that is Anaxagoras' idea of it being the mind, and he calls that nous. And naturally, the next step is going to be that the immortal principle is God. You see how that is evolving, that trajectory. So permanence is found in the external world as immortal principles. And several pre-Socratic philosophers try to find this immortal principle. You've got Thales, who thinks it's water, Anaximenes, who thinks it's air, Pythagoras, who says it's numbers, non-material, Heraclitus, who says it's fire, and with fire you've got something interesting. You have that part of the immortal principle is change. And reality is intentions of opposites, and reality is always in conflict. And Heraclitus also said these are you see how these concepts are really, underlying what became our ways of thinking in philosophy. Heraclitus also says there is the one and then there is the many. And the one is immanent in all things. And then, of course, Anaxagoras said the one is the nous. And Parmenides said the one, the truth, the God is separate from appearance and opinion. And this separation has the utmost importance into what is going to happen. This is where the classic mind takes leave of its romantic origin and says the good and true are not the same, and it goes its separate way. So Socrates, this gives, you see where we're going. Socrates expands on the ideas of Anaxagoras and Parmenides and pulls them into full fruition. So at this time, we still did not have the dichotomies of mind-matter, subject-object, form-substance. These are dialectical inventions that come later. The modern mind does not see these as inventions. The modern mind thinks that these dichotomies were available all along. They were the structure of the universe, and that they were just there for the Greeks to discover. But if you ask modern men modern people to point to these dichotomies, they can't. So these dichotomies are, in fact, these are ghosts. Then they are the ghosts, they are the immortal ghosts of the modern mythos, and we see it as real because we are in that mythos. We don't step out of the mythos and say, oh look, there's those dichotomies that we actually decided upon. We think that they are innate in the structure of the universe because we are in that mythos. So because the Greeks have developed the power to abstract, examine objectively, this is and extract that immortal principle, this is the exact moment that reality is placed on the butcher's block to become the quarry of the analytical knife, and the rest is history. So their common effort to find an immortal principle that exists leads us again to call these the cosmologists. And they could not agree on what that immortal principle is. You know, Heraclides' disciples said that that was change and motion, and Parmenides' disciples said that reality has to be fixed. So the resolution to these cosmologist arguments come from the sophists, the teachers of wisdom, who teach that not any single truth, but the improvement of man is the immortal principle, and that all principles and truths themselves are relative, that the solution is that man is the measure of all things. The resolution of the arguments of the cosmologists came from a new direction entirely, from a group Phaedrus seemed to feel were early humanists. They were teachers, but what they sought to teach was not the principles, but the beliefs of men. Their object was not any single absolute truth, but the improvement of men. All principles, all truths are relative, they said. Man is the measure of all things. These were the famous teachers of wisdom, the sophists of ancient Greece. So Socrates is in the middle of a war between those who think truth is absolute and those who think truth is relative. And this makes his hatred of the sophists make sense. Because you see now that Plato was defending the absolute truth against the decadence of the sophists. Plato becomes married to the idea that absolute truth is a much more is a much more useful and much more productive way that mankind can operate the world. And you know, he's right when you think about it, because this is the beginning of the type of scientific understanding of the world that's going to lead to the progress that we have in the modern age. Now, Plato's hatred of the sophists makes sense. He and Socrates are defending the immortal principle of cosmologists against what they consider to be the decadence of the sophists, truth, knowledge, that which is independent of what anyone thinks about it, the ideal that Socrates died for, the ideal that Greece alone possesses for the first time in the history of the world. It is still a very fragile thing. It can disappear completely. So you see, it's like critical that Plato defend this mode of understanding of reality against, you know, the mode of understanding of man as the measure of all things, and we want to improve, and whatever improves us is what we want to do, versus no, there's an absolute truth, we can extract it, and this is reality. So Plato hates the sophists because they threaten the progress of this idea, and he can envision, you know, he's a visionary. He can see how this idea can actually help mankind to conquer the world, really, to conquer the material world to its benefit, to their benefit. And Pirsig agrees that here, he agrees that without this elevation of the truth, if the idea of truth had been allowed to perish, we would still be in the Dark Ages. The result of Socrates' martyrdom and Plato's unexcelled prose that followed are nothing less than the whole world of Western man as we know it. If the idea of truth had been allowed to perish unrediscovered by the Renaissance, it's unlikely that we would be very much beyond the level of prehistoric man today. The ideas of science and technology and other systematically organized efforts of man are dead centered on it. It is the nucleus of it all. Okay, so now I want to ask you a question. What if we had just stayed in that sense that man is the measure of all things, and we didn't get science per se? Or do you think we would have gotten science another way, or something like science? Or is it possible that the improvement of mankind would have occurred in another fashion? Do we even know? So that's like, once I wish I could find it. Alan Watts said, "Why is it better to live longer?" That's a good question. And yet we're absolutely dead set on living as long as we can. Anyway, that's a philosophical question to think about. Are we better off with, yes, we live longer, yes, we don't have disease, yes, we don't have all this other stuff, but along with that, we have the meaning crisis. So it's just something that I think is an ongoing question. And so that's the conclusion. That's the conclusion of the detective work that Phaedrus has done. Now all he's found, the nucleus of it all, is the idea of truth. But what the sophists are saying seem to be opposed to this idea of truth, and this opens up a new investigation for Phaedrus, because what the sophists are saying are not opposed to his ideas about quality. Man is the measure of all things. Yes, that's what he's saying about quality. Man is not the source of all things, as the subjective idealist would say, nor is he the passive observer of all things, as the objective idealist and the materialist would say. The quality which creates the world emerges as a relationship between man and his experience. He is a participant in the creation of all things, the measure of all things. It fits, and they talk rhetoric. That fits. So I think it's really time for us now in this day and age to look at the statement, man is the measure of all things, by the way, because let's look at how we are going to evaluate information going forward in light of the fact that we have come to a point where there is just too much information. There are too many parts. The analytical knife is cut and cut and cut and cut, that we are in chaos. There's too much of it, let's just say, to process in the old way, the dialectical way. And the two movies on the one screen is absolutely our reality these days. We have come to the point where there's so much stuff going on that we can actually create a reality that we can create a reality. And we are so far removed from the original source of that reality, which is that experience in the world of a biological being without preconceived notions. So what doesn't fit for Phaedrus is the idea that the sophists promoted virtue. And because Plato says that the sophist profession is teaching virtue. So how does that fit at all with the previous statement? Virtue, if it applies anything at all, implies an ethical absolute. The previous statement that there isn't an ethical absolute. A person whose idea of what is proper varies from day to day and can be admired for his broad-mindedness, but not for his virtue. So how can they get virtue out of rhetoric? This is never explained anywhere. Something is missing. So again, more detective work, and he goes sifting through ancient Greek histories, looking for clues that lead to what's missing. What this does mean, that the sophists teach virtue, seems actually to reside in the other camp, like virtue is a strict thing. This is how to be a virtuous person in the world, and that's more in the camp of truth. There's an absolute virtue. There are absolute virtues. He has reached a passage that describes the very soul of the Homeric hero, the legendary figure of pre-decadent, pre-Socratic Greece. The flash of illumination that follows these pages is so intense, the heroes are never erased, and I could see them with little effort or recall. So what he's saying is this: the electroshock never erased this memory. There is then a passage from the Iliad concerning the hero Hector, the leader of the Trojan army, and the passage is the speech that Hector gives to his wife as his capture and death and her slavery is going to become imminent. You may live in Argos and work at the loom in another woman's house, or perhaps carry water for a woman of Messina or Hyperia. Sore against your will, but hard compulsion will lie upon you. And then a man will say as he sees you weeping, this was the wife of Hector, who was the noblest in battle of the horse-taming Trojans, when they were fighting around Ilion. This is what they will say, and it will be fresh grief for you to fight against slavery bereft of a husband like that. But may I be dead, may the earth be heaped over my grave before I hear your cries, and of the violence done to you. When he had kissed his dear son and dandled him in his arms, he prayed to Zeus and to the other gods, Zeus and ye other gods, grant that my son be, as I am, most glorious among the Trojans, and a man of might, and greatly rule Ilion. And they may say, as he returns from war, he is far better than his father. So you see here the heroic excellence that we associate with the legendary hero. We all have our own heroes who look in the face of death with bravery, let's just say, and at the same time acknowledge the deep emotion of the tragedy of what will invariably befall those that they love once they are conquered. What moves the Greek warrior to deeds of heroism is not a sense of duty as we understand it, duty towards others. It is rather duty towards himself. He strives after what we translate as virtue, but the Greek arete, excellence. We shall have much to say about arete. It runs through Greek life. And the next part I'm just going to read because it's the climax of Phaedrus's long-suffering detective work. Phaedrus is fascinated too by the description of the motive of duty towards self, which is an almost exact translation of the Sanskrit word dharma, sometimes described as the one of the Hindus. Can the dharma of the Hindus and the virtue of ancient Greeks be identical? And then Phaedrus feels tugging to read the passage again, and he does so. And then what's this? That which we translate virtue, but in Greek is excellence? Lightning hits. Quality, virtue, dharma. That's what the Sophists were teaching. Not ethical relativism, not pristine virtue, but arete, excellence, dharma, before the Church of Reason, before substance, before form, before mind and matter, before dialectic itself. Quality had been absolute. Those first teachers of the Western world were teaching quality, and the medium they had chosen was that of rhetoric. He had been doing it right all along. So quality had been the immortal principle. It had been the absolute, the metaphysical substrate of the experience of everything. Reality. Yep, he had been doing it right. And rhetoric, of course, being the art form that articulates that excellence. The rain has lifted enough so we can see the horizon now, a sharp line demarking the light gray of the sky and the dark gray of the water. So I'm putting this line in because I'm not quite sure how to interpret it. You know, this is going to be some kind of representation of the process, as we know that these topographical descriptions are. We can see the horizon now, so we can see the dividing. One sub-theme of this whole book has been divisions and wholes. So what does this mean in this situation? You have the light, you have the, we know we've talked about the sky, the high country, and the bottom of the ocean, and so I'm not quite sure what to make of that, so I just want to throw that in case any of you have ideas. The book, and this is a book on Greek philosophy, it's by someone called Kitto, K-I-T-T-O, had more to say about this arete of the ancient Greeks. When we meet arete in Plato, he said, Kitto, we translate it as virtue and consequently miss all the flavor of it. Virtue, at least in modern English, is almost entirely a moral word. Arete, on the other hand, is used indifferently in all categories and simply means excellent. So how does excellence manifest in a hero? And then there's a description of the hero who has arete. And the hero who has arete does a lot of things well on a broad spectrum of disciplines, like he can wrestle, he can kill and butcher an ox, he can build and sail a boat, he's able to appreciate art, and he's able to respond to it emotionally, and he's able to be a good husband. But he doesn't specialize in anything, and to these Greeks, the Sophists, specialization is not good. Specialization, winnowing down and focusing one's life is not part of the equation. It's the totality that counts. So I hope, again, you're seeing the pattern. We're talking about a way of seeing the world as a totality and a way of seeing the world as parts, and that is coming up again and again. He is, in fact, an excellent all-rounder. He has surpassing arete. Arete implies a respect for the wholeness or oneness of life and a consequent dislike of specialization. It implies a contempt for efficiency, or rather a much higher idea of efficiency, an efficiency which exists not in one department of life, but in life itself. And that kind of describes the spiritual rationality that we've been talking about. Wholeness versus specialization. So here you have a very different pattern of reality than that of Plato and worse of Aristotle. And efficiency to us in the modern age is of the highest value. And what creates efficiency? The efficient is pursued in all manner of what we do in the modern world, in commerce, in technology, in relationships. You know, think of online dating. How efficient is that? It's pulled out of the whole context of life itself. Phaedrus remembered a line from Thoreau, "You never gain something but that you lose something." And now he began to see for the first time that the unbelievable magnitude of what man, when he gained power to understand and rule the world in terms of dialectic truth, had lost. So if you can abstract a world and boil it down to immortal principles, then the same mechanism that can extract you out of the world. You are no longer connected with nature. You're looking at it objectively, impartially, and then taking that abstraction and dominating it, like you are not of the land at all, but some super smart space alien who's come here to mine resources. So Alan Watts often commented how we feel we need to rule and dominate nature. And as I talk, I remember him commenting on some of the houses on the hillside near where he docked his houseboat in Sausalito. And he commented that they use bulldozers to dig into the land and make it a flat surface to build a big house, rather than looking at the way the actual structure of the land was and integrating the architecture into that. And they did do that with some houses. Some of the houses had this beautiful quality of being of the land, and some of them dominated the land. One can acquire some peace of mind from just watching that horizon. It's a geometer's line, completely flat, steady, and known. Perhaps it's the original line that gave rise to Euclid's understanding of lineness, a reference line from which was derived the original calculations of the first astronomers that charted the stars. Phaedrus knew, with that same mathematical assurance Poincare had felt when he resolved the fusion equations, that this Greek arete was the missing piece that completed the pattern. But he read on now for completion. Okay, so the first thing is that's some insight to the horizon, but I don't think it's answering the question of the division that I was wondering about. Secondly, we're very happy to see Phaedrus's Poincare moment, and that is it, that arete. And we see that the significance for both Poincare and Phaedrus is that of is a reality-shifting nature. Phaedrus knows that the dialecticians are projecting onto the sophists what they are actually doing. They're persuading people away from the good and toward the truth. So they're using persuasion to get people away from this so-called decadence of the good and toward, this pure, pristine truth. And away from the whole and toward the parts. And to top it off, they use rhetoric. They use, again, persuasive language to make a case for dialectic, which is weaker than rhetoric due to that fragmenting mechanism, due to the fact that it doesn't work with the whole. It fragments the whole and then observes those fragments. So Plato's, again, doing exactly what he's accusing the sophists of doing. We always condemn most in others, he thought. That's that which we most fear in ourselves. But why, Phaedrus wondered? Why destroy arete? And no sooner had he asked the question than the answer came to him. Plato hadn't tried to destroy arete. He had encapsulated it, made it a permanent fixed idea out of it, had converted it to a rigid, immobile, immortal truth. He had made arete the good, the highest form, the highest idea of all. It was subordinate only to truth itself, in a synthesis of all that had gone before. That is why the quality that Phaedrus had arrived at in the classroom had seemed so close to Plato's good. Plato's good was taken from the rhetoricians, so it was very close to the source. Phaedrus searched, but could find no previous cosmologist who had talked about the good. That was from the sophists. The difference was that Plato's good was a fixed, eternal, and unmoving idea, like virtue. Whereas for the rhetoricians, it was not an idea at all, more like Tao. For the rhetoricians, the good just was. You don't need any definition. The good was not a form of reality. It was reality itself, ever-changing, ultimately unknowable, in any kind of fixed, rigid way. So the cosmologists don't talk about the good. Their approach to reality, to finding the immortal principle, is value-free. And now we're going to go through Plato's and Aristotle's process of subjugating arete, of taking a view of reality in which excellence, in which quality was central to reality, and indeed was reality itself, as Phaedrus proposes, and then objectifying it and making it the subject of truth, and truth then becomes reality, and subsequently it is our reality. This is our reality in the world, the modern world, of subjects and objects. Why had Plato done this? Phaedrus saw Plato's philosophy as a result of two syntheses. The first syntheses, he tried to resolve differences between the Heracleitans and the followers of Parmenides. So Plato has to resolve this conflict that prevents truth from being primary. That means that he has to reconcile Heraclitus, that truth is change, and Parmenides, that truth is fixed. And these are two immortal principles. A horse, for example, an animal, is always changing appearances, born, living and dying. But hoarseness itself is the form, it's the changeless, and that can stay within the domain of the gods. So do you see what he's doing? This whole process, is the beginning of the use of the analytical knife. Plato's second synthesis is the incorporation of the sophist arete into this dichotomy of ideas and appearance. So once you've codified this good and contained it as a dialectical idea, then another philosopher can come along and with the same dialectical methods further relegate the good underneath truth. And now that, by definition, is the true order of things. And this makes it a lot easier to use the good as just a tool within this higher order, within the true order of truth being at the top. Such a philosopher was not long in coming. His name was Aristotle. Aristotle felt that the mortal horse of appearance, which ate grass and took people places, and gave birth to little horses, deserved far more attention than Plato was giving it. He said that the horse was not mere appearance. The appearance is clinging to something, which is independent of them, which, like ideas, is unchanging. The something that appearances cling to, he named substance. And at that moment, and not until that moment, our modern scientific understanding of reality was born. And that's what's so great about the section. Right there is such an important revelation in terms of the origin of scientific truth, which gave us such progress and is now causing us so many problems, because now we look at things in terms of substance, the materialism. There it is. There's the beginning of the problem. Beginning of the progress, beginning of the problem. Under Aristotle, the reader, whose knowledge of Trojan arete seems conspicuously absent, forms and substances dominate all. The good is a relatively minor branch of knowledge called ethics. Reason, logic, and knowledge are his primary concerns. Arete is dead, and science, logic, and the universities we know it today have been giving their founding charter to find and invent an endless proliferations of forms about the substantive elements of the world and call these forms knowledge and transmit these forms to future generations as the system. And this, of course, describes that analytical process to find and invent, to find and invent an endless proliferation of forms and substantive elements. So you see exactly where it got started, and I think this is absolutely fascinating and terrifying at the same time. So what happened to poor rhetoric? Well, this floundering, let's just say the daemon of the dead sophists, still left over after they're long gone and buried. And to the sophists, rhetoric was learning itself. It is articulating quality into reality. So now rhetoric is reduced to grammar, basically, and good rhetoric, good rhetoric would coast through the Grammarly app, with not too many flags. And bad rhetoric is that which has spelling errors, and certainly this is how we've learned how to write. I mean, when you think of how you learned how to write in grade school, what did it have to do with? Did it have to do with, making your ideas? What do you associate with learning how to write more than anything? You associate with grammar and spelling. And what about that rhetoric that certain politicians these days are accused of? Well, that's empty rhetoric. That's designed to be persuasive. And it doesn't matter what the truth is, so to speak. We'll learn the truth in our other academic courses and then learn a little rhetoric so that we can write it nicely and impress our bosses who would advance us to higher positions. Forms and mannerisms, hated by the best, loved by the worst. Year after year, decade after decade, little front row readers, mimics with pretty smiles and neat little pins out to get their Aristotelian A's, while those who possess the real arete sit silently in the back of them, wondering what is wrong with themselves that they cannot like this subject. So now in the universities, how do we as a culture approach the good? What is our relationship with quality? Well, it's trying to define it. And if we can't define it, then we ignore it. It doesn't mean anything because we can't measure it scientifically, although we certainly try. The good is ultimately unimportant because it's subjective. And it's only important when we can, cobble together some measurable consensus of what is good. Like, and certainly in psychology, you have psychological tests, depression index, well-being index, and stuff. So the good is the happy stuff, and the bad is the sad stuff, let's just say, in psychology. And that has a lot of utility in one way, but in a lot of ways it leaves out an awful lot. It's a lot of the problem. Happiness and good are not objective terms. We cannot deal with them scientifically, and since they are not objective, they just exist in your mind. So if you want to be happy, just change your mind. Aristotelian ethics, Aristotelian definitions, Aristotelian logic, Aristotelian forms, Aristotelian substances, Aristotelian rhetoric, Aristotelian laughter. And the bones of the sophists long ago turned to dust, and what they said turned to dust with them, buried so deep and with such ceremoniousness and such unction and such evil that only a madman centuries later could discover the clues needed to uncover them and see with horror what has been done. The road has become so dark, I have to turn on my headlight now to follow it through these mists and rain. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next Sunday for chapter 30.